welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by a now solid friend of the show. This is the third return visit, and I am so excited to talk about this phenomenal book. So welcome back. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yeah, thanks for time number three here. I'm Josh Rountree. I am a writer living in Austin, Texas. My latest book is called The UNKILLABLE Frank Lightning. It's from Tachyon Publications, and my shorthand tagline is Frankenstein in a Wild West show. But what it's really about is a woman named Catherine Coleridge, who is a doctor and an occultist in the 1870s. And when her husband is killed, she uses those talents to bring him back to life, and things do not go well. So she sort of runs from the problems that she's created, and as the book begins, she has hired a couple of killers to help her track him down and put him back in the grave once and for all.
Oh, gosh, just such a great concept. It is. Oh, such a blast. I have so many questions, but first, sort of generally, you've been here before in the past to talk about first The Legend of Charlie Fish and then a short story collection, Death Aesthetic. What was it like returning to the weird Western genre?
Yeah, I mean it was a natural offshoot of the last book, really. I've been for a while now writing, among other things, these kind of monster stories set in old Texas, kind of basically anywhere from 1830 to 1930 kind of time frame. And of course, the Legend of Charlie Fish was about the 1900 hurricane in Galveston, but of course it featured a fish man that was kind of reminiscent of the creature from the Black Lagoon. So after that, I kind of had it in my head that I wanted to take a stab at another one of the universal monster archetypes, and so I followed it up with Frankenstein. So this actually, the book exists in the same world. I don't really call it a sequel. Although there, for anyone who's read Charlie Fish, there is a major character crossover. So it's definitely a continuation of that story, but you don't have to read one or the other. They design them where they can stand alone.
Nice. Yeah, I really love that. I like to call it like a constellation of novels or like a sister novel or something, maybe. Like, I
Yeah.
love just the expansive world that you're building there. So I'm curious about what drew you to, adapting the Frankenstein story in particular. You talked a little bit about that, but I'm curious about, when did you first encounter the text or the film and what made you love it?
Gosh, the Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, I've loved since they used to show them on, Saturday afternoon, television stations when I was a kid. They always kind of had monster movies and that sort of thing happening, in those days. And so I've really loved those. I was probably in my teens when I read Frankenstein, and of course it's a phenomenal book. I read it several times since, so I'm a fan of really both of it. Probably deeper into the movies and the Universal monsters maybe than I am the original text, but all of it was certainly an influence on this. And so whenever I was kind of looking at where do I want to go with this next one, Frankenstein seemed to be the logical choice. I've the book has a lot to say about kind of the nature of death. And I feel like, going even to my short story collection, Death Aesthetic, I've kind of been on that kick lately. You sort of, as a writer, you go through phases of what your work seems to be about thematically. And I've really been writing a lot about death for the last 5 or 6 years. And Frankenstein's a natural fit for that because, that's kind of the whole problem here is, Catherine has gone against the natural laws of the universe, basically, and everyone is kind of paying for it with the fallout in this novel.
Catherine is such a fascinating character. I'd love to talk about her a little bit more, especially her unique blend of medicine and sort of magics. Could you talk about sort of, yeah, shaping her and let's call it her skill set?
Yeah, I kind of wanted her to be a really from kind of a progressive family at the time. She is She went to medical school and is practicing medicine in the 1870s. And obviously, a woman doing that at that time is an outlier for sure. And but she was someone who always had the support of her family. At school, she sort of fell in with this organization called the Three Rose Temple, which is a made up occult order basically for this universe. And when she has some tragedy in her life, she ends up turning kind of to that side of her knowledge more than she does to the medical side. And things kind of go awry. But whenever I was kind of putting together the story, I thought, okay, so in Frankenstein, you've got it's basically science taken to its extreme. And I really wanted her to be a doctor. So she would sort of have that part of that in her head of what she needed to do to kind of try and bring her husband back to life. But in this world, it's all about black magic. And so I really wanted her to be invested in that as well, kind of to sort of give my reason for having him back there. So I think she becomes a more interesting character because she's kind of well-rounded with both of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. It, it made me nostalgic for my teaching days when I used to teach medieval history at Stony Brook College. Something I used to talk about a lot with the Middle Ages is that like the boundaries between like medicine and magic and religion were a lot blurrier back then than they
Yeah.
are today. And I think you could even kind of see that in this story here because like a lot of the same ingredients are used, but in different ways with different intentions. And I think that like it's a really interesting character trait because with the medicine angle, you associate like a sort of like rigorousness or discipline or like scientific objective type thinking. And then that's just balanced by this sort of, much more, how would you
The
say?
occult leanings where she basically just kind of lets loose and it's the other side of her personality. But yeah, you're right. It's all kind of an amalgam in a lot of respects, and that's certainly how she sees it. She sees each part of it just an extension of herself and what she's learned. But when she gets, you know, among other people, they don't necessarily see it as something good, that she's got this other side of her.
Oh, absolutely. And, I think the move, like being a doctor, marks her out as separate at the time anyway, because she was doing things, as you said, that like other women were not able to do or couldn't do. And then the magic like compounds that. Could you talk a little bit about, let's say, her traveling companions? I really, really enjoyed the dynamic with the men she has hired for this mission.
Yeah, she's spent a lot of time just kind of, really torturing herself for what she believes or the really critical errors that she's made. She's basically, decades have passed in her life where she's just kind of floundering. And so she finds these two kind of low gunfighter types that she believes will be able to help her. And, it's Seth and Aubrey Dawson, and they talk a whole lot about what tough guys they are and all the people they've killed and all the banks they've robbed, but whether they really have or not, we don't really know. I mean, they're just braggarts in a lot of ways. Aubrey, at least, can be charming when he wants to, but it's sort of hard for him to hide kind of the real person that he is, which is not a very good person. And Catherine certainly sees them, I think, for what they are, but she is at this point, she's willing to associate with them because she doesn't think she's any better than they are. She thinks that her mistakes are worse than anything they could have done. And so she gets to the point essentially where she spent so long with this guilt that she finally just wants to stop it. So she realized the only way to do that is to kill her husband, Frank. And she finds these guys to go help her do it.
Was it really fun writing like cowboy dialogue? There's this one scene where the one brother Seth is, sort of trading barbs with another guy Thirsty, and I'm like, oh, this just like sounds so fun to write. This like sort of veiled and not so veiled insults and just them circling each other like sharks.
Oh, it's my favorite part of it. I really, really love it. I spend a lot of time trying to get that just right. And as I'm doing, I can definitely see kind of where a lot of my influence is on that. I'm a big Larry McMurtry fan, and his dialogue in Lonesome Dove and a lot of his other westerns is just really sharp and fantastic. True Grit by Charles Portis, the dialogue that's one of the best written dialogue novels ever. And I certainly, especially in Legend of Charlie Fish, I was really trying to capture the voice of something like that novel. But definitely the dialogue with it sort of lives in my head anytime that I'm writing something Western like that. You're not really writing how people would actually talk, I think, but you're writing it so it's entertaining to a reader and it sounds cool, and hopefully works well. And the secret sauce, I think, is and I don't think I ever got this until a reviewer mentioned it when Charlie Fish came out. A lot of my dialogue, I think, is influenced by the Coen brothers, particularly like Raising Arizona and some stuff like that. I love, their films, and so a lot of that stuff I think is sort of spinning around my brain too.
That's such a great parallel. Yeah, because I think the thing that the Coen brothers and the writers that you're talking about share is that everybody does speak in like a really mannered, unrealistic way, but it just like adds to the mood and all these other things that like do a lot for your storytelling. I was also kind of reminded of Deadwood, which I think is
Yeah.
another property where there's, yes, very flowery, very ornate language, but it like reveals a different sort of authenticity, like of the just the vibe of the time.
Yeah, and that was certainly in my head too. I tried to pull up a little bit short of Deadwood level because Deadwood almost goes to the point of being like a Shakespearean Western or something like that. Like it's so over the top with the dialogue, but of course it works fabulously. But I wasn't sure if I could pull that off entirely, but I like the middle ground that I staked out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're oh gosh, I'm blanking on the word for the quotes before the text starts. Is that epigram?
Yeah, I always get confused. I never can remember if it's epigram or epigraph because those are definitely two different things. But yes,
The quotes before the text starts.
yeah, but
You
whichever
have
one they are, yeah.
you have Frankenstein right next to The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, which is also like one of my favorite movies of all time. And that mashup, I think, also is like, yeah, gives you a sense of the flavor of the language too.
Well, and that Liberty Valance quote, like I really wanted to put that in there because to me that's a lot of what the book is about too, is just the sort of mythical nature of the Old West, and it doesn't really matter if it's true or not as long as we believe it. And we've sort of been driven to believe a certain version of the West by Hollywood, which was originally influenced by these Wild West shows that are in this book. And I like having Catherine kind of in her time period already sort of sniffing out that, yeah, I was part of the real thing here, and this is sort of glorifying violence in a way that I'm not super comfortable with.
Mm. Oh, absolutely. And that like myth making was already underway by the people who were
Yeah.
living it. Like it's not even something that like history did afterwards. I'm so interested in the Wild West shows, and I'm curious if you looked into them at all because you had people who had, yes, like done incredible things or dangerous things or criminal things in their lifetime, but they were also exaggerating and fictionalizing their lives as they were performing them. So what did you find out about those?
Yeah, totally. This My Wild West show was certainly based on, the Buffalo Bill Wild West show, which was, there were dozens of them, but of course his was the most popular. And in the middle of, what we think of as the Old West unfolding, he's already basically going on these tours and doing these reenactments of famous battles and taking, a troop of people along with him. And initially it was, he could go to the East Coast to people who had never visited the West, and it was, all very exotic to them. But eventually, he just toured the country. And you're right, he was creating myths as he went along. He would tell stories about all of his grand adventures, and some of them were true, and some of them were made up, and some of them he borrowed from other people. And it just became, impossible to sort of discern what was true and what wasn't. And you have those carried on well into the early 20th century when Hollywood was starting up, and you actually had crossover between people who were in the Old West shows and people who were in the early, cowboy movies from Hollywood. And so there was really no letdown. And so by the time you get to that, that classic era of, Hollywood cowboy movies, that's kind of why they are how they are. You've kind of got the hero and the villain, and but of course it was never so cut and dry in real life.
Absolutely. When I was studying history, my advisor used to say, don't go looking for friends in history. Like, because none of them were your friends. Even like the good guy in the story is still not your friend. Yeah.
Yeah, and it makes a more interesting story. Like, Catherine is technically the protagonist, but she's not super likable. She definitely doesn't make the right decisions most of the time, but hopefully, you're still rooting for her to kind of get it figured out. And the bad people in the story, some of them end up being, much more sympathetic or at least misunderstood. So I think hopefully doing that makes the whole thing a bit more interesting.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I'd love to actually talk a little bit more about Catherine to return to her because you're right, she's not terribly likable, but she is like a really interesting spin on Victor Frankenstein in some ways that I really enjoyed. The one that stands out to me the most is that she's much less woe is me than
Yeah.
than Victor is. Like how else what were you thinking when you were adapting a character like that?
I just think that I wanted to make her very matter of fact. Like she is very honest with herself and with everyone else. And she is sort of unrelenting in the way that she tortures herself for all of her mistakes. Like I feel like she has all these regrets, and at several different points in her life, things could have gone dramatically different, and she would have had a really wonderful life. And so, but I didn't want her to, to spend the whole book kind of wallowing about it. I think at the very beginning, she's kind of reached the point where she has been that person for a long time and she's grown tired of it and she wants to do something about it. And so basically, I think from there on out, she doesn't try to place blame for what she's done on any of the other characters. She doesn't really judge any of them for their bad mistakes. She sort of comes from a position of, yeah, I screwed all this up. I probably can't fix it, but I'm going to do my best to try.
Yeah. And yeah, as difficult as she is to like, there is something sort of admirable about that because I feel like, a complaint that I commonly have about Victor Frankenstein is that like he's very much like, why did this happen to me? As though he is not the author of all of
Yeah.
his worries
And
and
she's
woes.
like, oh, this happened to me because I really messed up.
Yes, yep. I don't want to reveal too much, so, I'll frame this very broadly, but I'd love to talk more about how you conceived Frank. The scene in which you meet him is absolutely amazing. Like his presence is built up, there's just so much creeping dread, and then that scene where you first meet him, phenomenal. So can you talk about what went into crafting your, monster, quote unquote, lots and lots of air quotes?
Yeah, I wanted him to at least be influenced by the Frankenstein from the movie, but not, but a little bit more in control of his faculties at the point that we meet him in the I guess the present era of the book, and so the present era of the book is in 1905, and then there's some flashback scenes to 1870. So there's a couple, but by 1905 he really is he's pretty much in control of himself. And but I wanted him to obviously be tall. He's a little greenish, but it's because he's been dead for 30 some years, and so it's and I thought it would be a lot of fun to have him in the Wild West show as someone who couldn't die, so he could basically be a part of these sort of follies and be shot up with arrows and all this stuff and be able to kind of pop back up and to the amazement of the crowd, and it just seemed a fun way to work him. But I really, and it comes early in the book. Catherine remembers him as kind of a monster because when she first brought him back from the dead, kind of like Frankenstein's monster, he raged and killed some people, and she fled from that responsibility. And so that's the image of him that she's had throughout the decades. And when she first encounters him in 1905 and realizes that whatever kind of monstrous nature he had has sort of been contained, it really throws her for a loop because now she's there to kill him and she's not sure if that's the right course of action or not.
Yeah, and it kind of, clarified some themes for me, that like, we always talk about how monster is a subjective category and it's constructed and all these things, but like monster really is in the eye of the beholder because like when you get like Frank looking at Catherine, like he rightly in some ways sees her as his antagonist, his
Yeah.
monster, and I think that's really an interesting dynamic you build there.
Yeah, he feels like basically she owes him, more than he owes her at this point because he mentions being appreciative that he's back alive, but he's, it's more complicated than that. And so, yeah, I definitely wanted to, that's one of my favorite parts is kind of seeing characters through other characters' eyes and building your understanding of them that way. And I think that, ultimately the real monsters are a lot of the people that they find themselves surrounded by who really, look at them as kind of weirdos and outcasts and not our kind of people and decide to do something about it.
Yeah, Westerns are really great opportunities for ensemble casts, on the page or on the screen. And you do get a lot of like really interesting like variations on the standard inhabitants of your like Wild West town. And I think what was it like fleshing out your supporting cast, and were there particular icons or characters that you drew on?
I wanted to a point to take advantage of some of the Western archetypes and the reader expectations for those kind of things, so you could sort of spin them around a little bit. I think on the supporting characters, I think that Mabel Bones is one of my favorites. She's kind of my Annie Oakley, but a little bit younger and less worldly at the beginning of the book than the real Annie Oakley. But she was a super fun character to write. Falling Bird is a killer character. I think he sort of is the conscience of the book in a lot of ways. Like he's there with Catherine and kind of witnesses her through good and bad. And I think through his eyes we really kind of see how severely she has screwed things up, and so I think he's a really strong character and one that sort of endures that through the book and still comes out, in a really positive way at the end of it. But yeah, a lot of the townspeople, I kind of wanted to take, stock Western characters and sort of tweak them around a little bit.
When you are returning to sort of the weird Western sphere in your writing, are there like, you talked about some already, but are there other movies or texts that you sort of immerse yourself in to, capture the setting, the vibe, the mood?
I mean, I definitely always return to those books. The list of westerns I love is just The Unforgiven is a really great western where you kind of get some time with the different townspeople and they trying to figure out, what exactly is they're up to. And of course, it's a pretty harsh western, but it's certainly one of my favorites. I love All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy. It's technically not set in the Old West. It's set in the 1940s, but at a time and place in Texas, kind of that just way out in South Texas, where it very much still felt like the Old West at that time. And the characters delve down into Mexico, and it's just a really kind of beautiful and painful book. So I mean, there's just gosh, they're just endless books that inspire me. The Shootist by Glenn Swarthout is really great. It's about an old gunfighter who has prostate cancer, and he's basically going to El Paso to die about the turn of the century. And all the young and upcoming gunfighters want one last shot at him because he's kind of the king, and he just kind of wants to go there and finish his life. And that was a really good book, and actually the last Western movie that John Wayne ever made.
Oh, wow. That is a phenomenal movie. I did not know that was his last. That does.
Pretty sure it is. I think it is.
Yeah. Wow. And it resonates with what was happening to him in his life. My goodness. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah, this has been so fascinating, and I am so excited to recommend this book to our patrons and to see what you do next. So, do you think you will return to Weird Texas anytime soon?
I hope to. I won't say it's the next thing happening, but I have an idea for a couple of more books that if I get the time and opportunity that I'd love to do. One would be a continuation with one of the major characters that's in both books, if it worked out, and then one of them would be a bit earlier, but for now, those haven't started yet.
Great. Well, I am very excited to recommend this one to folks. So, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your book with me.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
No problem. All right, patrons, listeners, it's your turn. Please check out The Unkillable Frank Lightning. By the time that you hear this, it'll be out in the world. So head to your favorite bookstore or library or website. Josh, do you have a place you like to send people for books or?
You can go to my website and it sort of has a clearinghouse to all directions. It's joshrountree.com. There is no D in Rountree, so it's like round tree, but no D.
Nice. All right, you have your homework, patrons. I'm counting on you to pick this book up. All right, thanks so much for joining us. It is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.